Okay. Alright, so here I gathered some of the essential notes that you have, and this was also key. It says 5 to 38, find exact expressions given that this is equal to this and sine of pi over 8 is equal to this. But we want to know what the sine of negative 3 pi over 8 is equal to. So the first property I'm going to use is the fact that sine is an odd function. Odd function means that negative here next to the theta, you could pull it out in the front. So that makes your whole quantity negative. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. By the way, let me remind you, this problem has a lot of multi-steps in it. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of these properties. That's why I highlighted this in red, because the stuff in red, I'm going to try to rewrite like this. Having a pi over 2 minus some theta, right? So that I can make it equal to some other cosine theta, right? So let's focus on this part. How do I get this red stuff, the stuff inside the parentheses, to look like this? Now, it could be that your professor or your other students are able to do this automatically in their heads, but if you have to do the side work, do the side work, and I would recommend doing the side work. So how do I find out? Well, I want this stuff to equal this stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. Take this stuff to equal the red quantity right there, so that I can find that theta that fits this description. So let's go ahead and find theta. In order to find theta, let's subtract pi over 2 from both sides. Great. When you subtract pi over 2, you get negative theta equals 3 pi over 8 minus pi over 2. Now remember, you can't subtract fractions unless their denominators are the same. So I'm going to multiply this side top and bottom by 4. Great. Once you have it multiplied by 4, the denominators are the same. So 3 minus 4 is going to give you negative 1 pi, which is just negative pi over 8. Because the negative in the top makes your whole fraction negative. Negative 1 pi over 8 is the same as negative pi over 8. Alright, so negative theta is equal to the negative of this. If we divide both sides by negative 1, that just gets rid of the negative. So your theta equals pi over 8. Great. So what I just did right now is I was looking for this. What can I do to fit this, and what theta would give me this? So the theta that I found was pi over 8. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this with pi over 2 minus the theta that I found, because this pi over 2 minus theta was equal to that red quantity. So what I did is I rewrote this in this format now. Once I have this rewritten as pi over 2 minus some theta, which in this case is pi over 8, that theta now becomes this theta, so the cosine of pi over 8, and we're just keeping this negative on the outside. That negative is just on the outside, it's just following us through. Now this just turned to cosine pi over 8 from this property right here. But then there's a problem, because right here you're given cosine pi over 12. We're not given pi over 8, so we still got to figure out what the heck this is, right? We know sine pi over 8. I know sine pi over 8, but I don't know cosine pi over 8. So this is a step where you would actually have to really take a deep look into your notes. So if I know sine pi over 8, but I don't know cosine pi over 8, there is a formula you can use. So if you're given sine of a certain angle and you want to find the cosine of that same certain angle, both are pi over 8, they're both pi over 8, that means you could use this formula right here, this trigonomic identity. Cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta equals 1. The only way you could use this identity if the thetas are the same. In this case, they are. See, so pi over 8 is the same as the pi over 8 here. If I know this one, then I could figure out the cosine of that by plugging it into this formula. So all I did right here is I just used that formula, but I plugged in my thetas, which in my case is pi over 8 here. So I go ahead and do that. So like I said, you're given that sine pi over 8 is this quantity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in that quantity right here. And remember, this just means the whole thing is squared. That's just notation. So that's all I did right there. That green stuff is what they gave me, and the squared is on the outside. Now what's left is for me to apply the square on the top and to the bottom of my function. So remember, square gets rid of this square root right here. And the square will apply to this 2. So 2 squared is 4, and the 2 gets rid of the square root right here. So this is what it looks like simplified. The square root on the top disappeared because the square got rid of it, and the 2 got squared, that turned to 4. Now let's go ahead and try to solve for cosine pi over 8. But there's a 2 there. We'll take care of that in a sec. First thing is, let's get rid of this stuff. Let's subtract that from both sides. If you subtract it from both sides, on the right side you get 1 minus 2 minus 2, square root of 2 over 4. We can't again subtract fractions unless they have the same denominator, so that 1 turns into 4 over 4. So this is going to turn, now that the denominators are the same, you can combine the numerators. So one thing you got to pay attention to is this negative goes to this 2, and it also goes right here. So this negative basically is distributing here because we're subtracting this whole quantity. So that's going to be 4 minus 2 plus square root of 2. See, that's what I have written there. And since their denominators are the same, we just combine the numerators. So here we combine like terms. 4 minus 2 is just 2. Great. Now, that's as much as I can do to simplify this. You can't cancel out here. This is as much as we can do to simplify. Great. Now, what I'm looking for is for the value of cosine pi over 8, because that's what I'm looking for right here. I simplified this into this. And now if I'm able to find this, then I'll be able to find my answer. So the opposite of a square right here, to get rid of the square, is to square root both sides. So I square root both sides. That gets rid of this square, and you're left over with the square root of this answer right here. Good. Let's apply the square to the top and the bottom. If we do that, you get this, because the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root just remains in the numerator. Finally, we have what cosine of pi over 8 is. It's this. But again, remember, the answer that we're looking for is the negative cosine pi over 8, because remember, this was an odd function and we pulled out that negative in the front. So our answer, therefore, is just the negative of this answer that we found. This is your answer. So the sine of negative 3 pi over 8 equals negative square root of 2 plus square root of 2 all over 2. And we found that out by converting this 3 pi over 8 using this formula into a cosine that involved pi over 8, because I was given that sine pi over 8 is over here, and if I know sine pi over 8, then I could figure out what cosine pi over 8 is over here by using this identity. So it involved a lot of multi-steps and a lot of algebra to work this one out. Let's move on to the next one. So now tan of 3 pi over 8. So this one's not too bad. So here, hold on, let me go back. So tangent in your notes is to find the sine over cosine. It's always defined that way. And let me go back to your notes. So tangent, where is it? Well, it's not here, but yes, it is somewhere. Right here. Tangent of theta equals sine over cosine. It's always the same. So tangent of 3 pi over 8 therefore is equal to sine of 3 pi over 8 divided by cosine of 3 pi over 8. Notice the theta must be the same in the top and bottom for it to be a tangent. So previously, by the way, the Berkeley math problems that you get, as you progressively move through the problems, you notice that you're building off another problem. Basically, we know that sine of negative 3 pi over 8 from our previous problem, right? We just solved for sine of negative 3 pi over 8. We found that this whole work, the answer was the negative of this. But because the sine function is odd, if this were to be positive, then your answer would be positive. So in this case, the sine 3 pi over 8 is going to be equal to this, the answer that we just got in number 34. Okay, that's great. We don't know what this is though. So we do know what sine 3 pi over 8 is. I don't know what cosine of 3 pi over 8 is. But remember, we have that trig identity such that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. Let's refer back to it. I'm using this. I'm going to use this again. So remember, whenever you have a sine, you don't know the cosine, all you got to do is plug into this identity. But again, some of these are very multi-step. So let's go back. So I know the sine of 3 pi over 8 is the positive square root 2 plus root 2 over 2. Now I'm going to find this using my trig identity. Since the angles are the same, that's great. I plug in what I know. I know that sine of 3 pi over 8 equals this. I'm going to apply the square to the top and bottom as before. Then to solve for the cosine squared 3 pi over 8, I'm going to subtract both sides. That 1 becomes a 4 over 4. Then again, that negative has to distribute, so it's going to be minus 2 minus root 2. 4 minus 2 is just 2. Great. Now we square root both sides to get rid of that squared. Let's get rid of that square. Great. And that's cosine 3 pi over 8. So cosine 3 pi over 8 is this stuff. Oh yeah, I just took the square of the top and bottom. Square root of 4 is 2. I put it on red because I'm about to plug that in. Great, I plugged them in. So this was my sine 3 pi over 8. This was from problem number 34. We just took the positive of it because in problem 34 we found the negative of sine 3 pi over 8. But because it's an odd function, the positive version of this is just positive. So anyways, I plugged in now for my sine and cosine. Now remember, when you divide two fractions, we learned that you use the flip and multiply rule. The 2 in the top cancels with the 2 in the bottom, and what you're left over on top is this, and this at the bottom. So there we go. That's your tangent of 3 pi over 8. Lastly, what is the tangent of negative 3 pi over 8? Again, this problem builds off the previous problem. Previous problem is this. Now we want to know the negative of this. Now don't go through hell and do all that work again. Just use the property that, and let's go back to your notes, using the property that tangent is an odd function. All you got to do is pull that negative out in front and use your previous answer. So let's go ahead. So our previous answer, the tangent of 3 pi over 8 is this answer. So therefore, the tangent of that negative value, pull out the negative, and it's just the negative of our previous answer, and you're done with number 38. And 38 was easy because you already did all the work for it beforehand. Pretty much that is it. Stuff like this takes like more than a day or hours of practice. So just definitely get your practice in, getting used to using all those theorems and formulas. They are in your notes. You just have to look really, really, really close. Hopefully that helped.